Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the speaker series that is hosted by the Indigenous Heritage Celebration and Indigenous students at Hopkins. We are delighted to have everyone tuning in to today's and to this evening's program where we are celebrating the Native American Heritage Month. We also recognize and celebrate Indigenous peoples' heritage and culture and tradition and impact and contributions here within the states. And so we're excited. And also we acknowledge the contributions and the work and the impact that Indigenous people have across the world, even beyond the states. And so I want to take this moment to welcome our guests, students, faculty, and staff to this evening program. We are hoping that you will either learn something, hear something that may be familiar, something that may resonate with your salient identities, or something that you may cause you to explore even more after this conversation. We have an awesome speaker who has joined us this afternoon virtually, and we're excited to hear what he will share with us. I did not introduce myself, but I'm Kwame Phillips, Associate Director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous students at Hopkins for their efforts and work that they do to uplift and elevate and to share the culture, the tradition, and the knowledge that comes from the Indigenous peoples communities on our campus. I also want to acknowledge the staff that helped place or help coordinate the very pieces to make this event happen. Madeline, Javon, Akosa, Cynthia, and Danae. And also Musuma Islam Lazak, who is not with us today, but she was definitely an intricate part in making sure this evening's program came into fruition. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Vice President of the Indigenous Students at Hopkins, Jasmine, and she is going to introduce our speaker for this evening. And after she introduces our speaker, Jake will take it from there. Thank you.
Okay, so Jake Skeets is, I'm so sorry for my pronunciation, but Jake Skeets is Sinajini, born for Tabaha. His maternal grandparents are the Tachini, and his paternal grandparents are the Todikozi. Skeets is from Vanderwagen, New Mexico. He's the author of Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers, winner of the National Poetry Series American Book Award and Kate Tufts Discovery Award. He holds an MFA in poetry from the Institute of American Indian Arts. His honors includes a 92Y Discovery Poetry Prize, Mellon Projecting All Voices Fellowship, and Whiting Award. Skeets is an assistant professor and teaches at DNA College in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Thank you so much. Yate, that means hello in Navajo or Tene. Thank you all so much for being here. I first just want to thank the students and staff and faculty and everyone that was involved in putting this particular event together. I'm just beside myself that I'm not able to join you there in person, but there was several things that happened early this morning that sort of made it a little more difficult to get there, unfortunately. So first, let me just please allow me to introduce myself in my native language. Yate, She Matthew Jake Skeets in She, Sinajini Nashlan, Tkobaha Bushes Chin, Tkachini Dashi Che, Do Turuk Ojan Dashinella. Hello, everybody. My name is Jake. As it was mentioned, I am Dene, and I have an internet culture and lexicon and thought and universe. We identify ourselves first with our clans, and these clans are inherited by our parents and grandparents. And so Sinajini, my first clan, is my mother's clan. And that means it can be sort of translated into Blackstreet Wood people. And there's a lot of different histories and origins of that particular clan But the one I like most is back when the Diné people were still hunting and gathering. There would be a particular group of people or one particular person who would lead the group, and they would sort of be at a distance and sort of leading and looking out for danger. And so what only people saw that were part of the main group and the main familial community was just a sort of black streak in the distance and at the horizon. Hence Black Streak Wood People. My second clan is Kabaha, which I inherit from my father, and he inherits that from his mother. Kabaha is salt water. So there's a lot of different origins as well, but the one that I was told is that it's an adopted clan, that it's a clan that we got from our southern relatives moving down into sort of like Apache country. And that's my clans. I have two more as well, but those are my grandfather's clan, who he inherits from his mother, and then my maternal grandfather's clan, who he inherits from his mother as well. And I'm coming to you all tonight from Saley, Arizona. I wish I was in Baltimore. I was very excited to visit the city for the first time. Saley, Arizona is a very small, unincorporated community in the northern part of Arizona, right at the Arizona-New Mexico border. It's a very small place, but it has immense beauty. To get to an airport, I have to travel like 3 hours to get to, to be able to travel to different places. So I made that journey this morning. Unfortunately, wasn't able to complete the journey, so I had to drive the 3 hours back. So I've been driving all day today and running just on a few hours of sleep. But I'm still happy to be here. I'm honored and super grateful that John Hopkins and the students and staff thought of me and invited me to come speak to you tonight. And I'm very excited to share some of the things that I've been thinking about over the past few years in regards to my work as a teacher and as a writer. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So tonight's talk is titled Deep Time, Land, and Language, Learning from Indigenous Thought and Lifeways. So I thought long and hard about the purpose of this particular discussion and this Heritage Speaker Series, and about the ask of learning from Indigenous heritages in order for us to further develop and evolve our current systems. And I think that's a very worthy goal in terms of restructuring and relanguaging our reality, especially as we transition into a post-pandemic one. So I'm very excited to share some of the things that I've been thinking about over the past few years in regards to that very thing. How do we move forward post-pandemic, hopefully, into a kind of new world where we pay more attention to Black and Brown perspectives in the way that we reconstruct and construct our systems of governance, social policy, education, and really just thoughts and lexicons and language systems. What does that look like when we begin to move past a colonial perspective and invite everyone to the table? And so tonight I thought I'd start first with a poem because I am primarily a poet. This poem is called Flood Song by Sherwin Bitsui. Sherwin Bitsui is a Diné poet from White Cone, Arizona. And this is what is known as a one-word poem. Let me read it first and I'll explain its importance. Toi. 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 So this particular poem repeats the word toi Twa is the Dene word for water. And the poem itself begins the collection and is centered in the page as it runs down sort of the entirety of the field of the page. And it opens us into this beautiful collection, which is a book-length poem that sort of feels like waves and rivers and tributaries as you move through the entire book. So I thought fitting that this particular word would open that particular journey. And as you might have noticed, twa is a word based on sound. Much of Dene language is based on sound first. It's also based on imagery, and it's also based in movement. So in a way to introduce myself, I also want to first introduce a few things about where I come from. And first, of course, is language. Dene language is very specific. There's not a way that you can generalize or talk very vaguely about a particular thing in Dene. For example, as a poet, I've been working more and more to incorporate more Dene words and sentences and phrases into my work in poetry. But I'm having specific issues. You see, my poetry tends to focus on fragments, on image solely without the use of narrative or explanation or exposition. What I found about Dene is that it doesn't operate in that manner. Instead, Dene requires us to position things that we explain and observe in its language within space and time. That a room is never just a room. A room belongs to someone. A room has a specific purpose. It sits in a specific part of the house. And you have to explain that particular context in order to translate the word room accurately into Dene. There always needs to be a frame of reference, a speaker, a subject, an object. There always needs to be movements. That type of specificity is a type of specificity that's brought into the way Dene communities have begun to shape or have actually shaped their thought processes and in turn shaped their communities. So today I'm actually very excited to talk to you about the ways that Dene communities have learned from their language, a language that's familiar with land and time and space, in its current functions as a native nation within the United States. The next, I also want to read another poem for you all, just to further cement the kind of perspective and the type of universe that exists here on Dene. This poem is called Brown Children, and it's by the poet Nia Francisco. It was one of the first Dene poets to be published. Brown Children. See my brown-bellied desert sparrowhawks, said the earth. Listen to cinnamon brown woman, her children browned from within her womb, browned as that of soil like red mesas and its hidden afternoon shades, like a rusty belly robin. The shy sky, who fathered her children, his skin is brown, brown like the bark of towering pine trees, and like the tiny fuzz off a fuzzy caterpillar, like a red horse with a black mane. Dancers of resonating drum songs, we are the children in brown, a brown that can't wash off. It remains a beautiful reflection in a puddle of rainwater, a brown in twirls of sand, blown by the winds in the moonlighted nights. Listen to this earth woman so bronzed, her children so bronzed, her children so reverent they prayed, whispering to the stars and seasons. She blesses them in these thoughts. Great grandfathers of the universe, you, the holy ones, recognize my daughters, my sons, know them by their sacred names, know their footsteps, let strands of positive thoughts hang from their mouths onward to the future. And that is Brown Children by Nia Francisco. And I wanted to share these two particular poems with you all to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, the type of perspective that I bring today, and the kind of, I guess, guidelines, if you will, that I want to share with you all about the ways that we can learn from Indigenous heritages. You see, it's not as linear as we would like it to be. We can't simply have a textbook on Indigenous thoughts, Indigenous thought processes. And the textbook, of course, wouldn't even talk about how we can apply that to our current governance systems, to our current structures, to our current reality. You see, Indigenous communities rarely act with such sort of black and white spaces. There's always room for nuance, always room for shade, always room for a kind of an entire world to slip in. And just as I was mentioning earlier with the fact that Diné language can't operate solely on fragment or vague comments, it requires a sense of perspective, a sense of grounding within the world. And I feel like that's the very first step that we can learn from. How do we ground ourselves in the places we come from? How do we ground ourselves in the lineages we come from? How do we ground ourselves in ourselves, if that makes sense? And I think that's where we can start. So again, the title of this talk is Deep Time, Land, and Language, as a way of learning from Indigenous heritages, or what I call Indigenous thought and lifeways. Today, I'm coming to you as a descendant of Deep Time. When I introduced myself earlier, I explained the lineage from which and where I speak and act. I can trace a lineage from where I stand through time, going back decades. My first clan is my mother's clan, and her mother's clan, and her mother's, and her mother's, going back to the beginning, or a beginning. My second clan is my father's mother's clan, and her mother's clan, and her mother's, and her mother's, going back to the beginning, or a beginning. Rexley Jim, a teacher, philosopher, and poet, and also former vice president of the Navajo Nation, notes that individualism is not a reality for Navajo people. We rarely speak for just ourselves. Rather, we come from communities and families that live through decades of active oppression. We come from those who survived and continue to survive. Our actions, our thoughts, our voices, our lives then are representations, embodiments of that commitment to survival. Deep time, as a concept, seeks to quantify our existence using a timeline. While this talk will speak against quantifiability with such linearity, I allow Deep Time's attempt to chart our existence because the timeline used is one made of earth. You see, we see deep time when we encounter mountains. We see deep time when we look into clifflands, swamplands, riverlands, beachlands. We literally see time. We see time when a sidewalk fractures, a light bulb goes out, and when the sun rises. Time unfolds us before us every day. David Ferrier notes, and I quote, "Deep time represents a certain displacement of the human and the divine from the story of creation. Yet in the Anthropocene, ironically, We humans have become that sublime force, the agents of a fearful something that is greater than ourselves. A single mine in Canada's tar sands region moves 30 billion tons of sediment annually, double the quantity moved by all the world's rivers combined. The weight of the fresh water we have redistributed has slowed the Earth's rotation. The mass extinction of plant and animal species is unlikely to recover for 10 million years. Ferrier does a great job at defining the way our current human-centered era is sounding very much like the apocalypse. Just recently, Congress failed to act on climate change to address this very apocalyptic tone. And I'm pretty sure you are all aware of what I'm talking about when we mention or equate climate change with the end of times. Is the end of the world coming? At the start of the pandemic, I was writing an essay for Emergence magazine as the world and our country shifted into a very unorganized type of governance system. And when my community around me began to fall ill, I was wondering a lot about this notion of the end of the world. And probably very serendipitously, Emergence magazine asked me to share my insights into the notion of apocalypse. And this is what I wrote for them. Apocalypse is a funny thing. I do not mean funny as in humorous, but funny as in there is not much to feel about it. For me, apocalypse has always been represented in two ways: as an end to human life or a replacement of human life. In the feature film Resident Evil Extinction, we follow the story of Alice navigating post-apocalyptic Las Vegas, where human life has ceased to exist due to zombie outbreaks. On the other hand, in the film X-Men Apocalypse, there's a prophetic tale about the character Apocalypse and his intention to destroy our current world and replace it with a new super civilization. Both of these representations seem overly dramatized. Apocalypse is actually a project of colonialism. The linearity of beginning and ending is the very construct of the American dream, for which we yearn and grieve. Our futures are set in a binary of success or apocalypse, depending on how tight we tie our bootstraps. The essay, Rethinking the Apocalypse, an Indigenous anti-futurist manifesto posted by indigenousaction.org, details the way apocalypse is a linear project that relies on a colonial past. It asks the question, why can we imagine the ending of the world, yet not the ending of colonialism? Colonialism is somehow both immune to an end and also reiterates that human lives should and can and do end. The essay itself rejects a colonial future and relies on the deep time of Indigenous people. After all, Indigenous people have gone through many beginnings and endings, but never linearly and never without teaching. When I was writing the essay, I came to the realization that Diné communities, Diné as a people, have gone through many apocalypses. In our creation story, there are talks of journey narratives where we move from world to world to world. Each one brings something new that we get to incorporate into our way of life. But we also carry with us elements from the prior world. In our journey narratives, these items range from foods to insects, to types of sands and rocks and minerals, and also teachings, and most importantly, language. We carried language through our apocalypses, through to today. The US colonial project has always functioned around the idea of apocalypse. After all, how could a country run if not on the brink of disaster? How could we motivate soldiers to battle or workers to the factory line? We do it by declaring that it's the end of the world. However, acting on climate change would not be in service to this country, right? It would halt the flow of labor and money across communities. The apocalypse, or today's apocalypse at least, is not climate catastrophe, but really an end to the American way of life. You see, colonialism is so powerful that it can even rewrite what death looks like. And just a quick note here, my slides aren't very substantial in terms of content. They're morely just visual aids to help us move through this particular talk. So don't feel frightened if I'm moving through and I'm not skipping a slide. Mark Rifkin is a Indigenous studies scholar. Rifkin explores the notion that Indigenous people exist in a timeless space within the American consciousness in his book, Beyond Settler Time, Temporal Sovereignty, and Indigenous Self-Determination. Rifkin argues that Native people exist in a time contingent on experience, and that experience is relative to the nature of the subject and its passage through time. Drawing from relativity within physics, Rifkin says that time's frame of reference puts Indigenous time in conversation with memory, historical events, settlements, and the perspectives of current space. Indigenous people somehow can simultaneously be the past, the present, and the future. Temporality then becomes a site for the active investigation into the way colonialism maintains a kind of surveillance of Black and brown bodies, because Black and brown bodies represent the past, present, and future. We are simultaneously past, present, and future. So how can we learn from deep time? I argue that we must move against a linear understanding of time, first and foremost, and instead seek to center the lineages of our lands and languages. But how? A step in that direction, I think, involves centering these very lineages in our reconstruction of our pedagogies, methodologies, and ontologies in a post-pandemic world. The pandemic illustrated what Black and brown communities already understood about our current governance system, that it's not created for us. At the height of the pandemic, I read so many posts about close family and friends falling ill and losing loved ones as the pandemic raged within the Navajo Nation. And like many communities across the country, we sought help and guidance from the very institution we fund to lead us in these kinds of scenarios. After all, its function is warding off the apocalypse, right? But we all realize that another primary function of government has always been colonialism, driven, at least today, by US market. So we gather here today, virtually, to learn about Indigenous heritage and the ways we begin to center these narratives in our institutions and agencies as we hopefully transition into a post-pandemic reality. So I first want to define Indigenous thoughts and lifeway. And really the simplest definition I can offer are that thought and lifeways are framed as indigenous ontology and ontological methods, a way of life, a way of being, a way of knowing. And I borrow this framework here from a group of researchers who developed a kind of indigenous ontological approach to studying psychiatry. As you can see in the model, in the in the center, there is noted indigenous thriving futures, where the future, right, is kind of a goal, kind of a step forward. And surrounded by it are 4 values: responsibility, reciprocity, relationships, and respect. And within those, there are the ideals of physical thriving, family and community thriving, psychological thriving, and educational thriving. That when we move in this particular way, we realize that the models that are possible, the kinds of governance and structures and systems and realities and coding that exist currently, don't necessarily have to be about beginnings and endings, don't have to be structured around apocalypse or the end of the world, and they don't have to be linear. Most indigenous communities across the country and perhaps across the globe follow a more circular approach to living, where humans are part of the world and not a sublime force within it. And so I want to talk to you right now about the way that my role as a writer and teacher has come to be about embedding a kind of thought and life way into my work, into my pedagogy, into my methodology, and into a kind of an ontology. So Diné College, where I currently work, is the first tribally controlled college in the United States. Established in 1968, the college was tasked with addressing the needs for self-determination for Navajo communities while reclaiming Navajo language and culture. In its early years, Diné College, known as Navajo Community College, became an intellectual and cultural hub as many Native scholars and thinkers walked through the halls and contributed to the important renaissance in tribal education, literature, etc. I often tell my students that famed writers like Leslie Marmon Silko taught at Navajo Community College and published Navajo Native writers through its own press, the Navajo Community College Press. Even our United States Poet Laureate Jar Harjo visited Diné College and remains an ardent fan of our work. Today, Diné College continues to improve on its legacy, achieving the new designation of a 4-year institution just a few years ago. Within Diné College is what's known as the Diné educational philosophy. And this philosophy is informed by a phrase or concept or idea or ontology within Diné known as Sa'a Narebik Ehojon. And pictured here on this slide is what's called a Diné wellness model. And this is just one example of many. I borrowed this particular example from the Navajo Nation Department of Self-Reliance, and they call it a pathway to reliance model. And this particular model, again, is informed by this phrase or concept or idea of Sa'a Narebik Ehojon. This philosophy or phrase or idea can be translated in many ways, but in the simplest terms, Sa'a Narebik Ehojon is the embodiment of balance and beauty through the acknowledgement and stewardship of relationships with all things, human and non-human, earthbound and beyond, visible and invisible, mental and physical, interior and exterior, etc. Sa'a Narebik Ehojon does not create binaries, and it exists beyond spectrum. You see, binaries tend to erase the possibility of nuance, the gray areas between the two ends. Spectrum, though more open, still relies that the frame of reference falls on a singular point on this spectrum in relation to the spectrum itself. So spectrum is not the right approach as well, or at least not the right translation for Sa'nage B'Keljon. It's beyond spectrum. It's beyond binary. Instead, Sa'nage B'Keljon revolves the simultaneity of all things existing all at once. And our job is to tend to these things and this balance and this circular movement as much as we can. As big as this sounds, Diné thought and lifeway includes ways of being and knowing that do just that. And its process first relies on the individual, ourselves, and the way we care for our own bodies and connection to the beyond. Today, I'm going to share with you all a paradigm developed for and informed by Diné communities that shape much of our agency across the reservation. What is known as the Diné wellness model creates a way to live and think about our realities that are informed by the land. Today, this model shapes the way we use language. And again, this is just one example out of many. So, what is the applicability of this model in real-world situations? How do we begin to achieve this? First, let's break down this particular model informed by, again, it all begins in the East, in Sahakes, and here on this model, it's the section in white. In Sahakes, or the East, represents thinking, or critical thinking, or what Diné poet Orlando White calls clear thinking. Filmer Bluehouse, a Diné medicine practitioner, noted that Diné knowledge has 3 tiers. The first tier is common knowledge, and this is knowledge that is achieved in the home and includes lessons on mannerisms, simple communication, and maybe introductory arithmetic and rhetoric. The second tier is what's called applied knowledge, or knowledge learned as a child matures into an adult. The third tier is esoteric knowledge, or knowledge and lessons learned within ceremony. And Sahakes, then, is the culmination of all 3 tiers. So this value, this first stage, this first point, this beginning, acts as a foundational approach to knowledge, as outward expression of the self and the self's connection to the universe. In my composition class, we always talk about the way our classrooms should serve our communities. I always remind them that the classroom, or the US classroom, has always been a mechanism for removal for Native people. So we should rethink the way we approach our classrooms. Moving on to so after the East comes the South, or Nahata, or what's called the planning stage of the model. A great friend and colleague, Manny Loli, breaks down the word Nahata into 3 parts. Na, or universe, Ha, which could mean the spiritual self, and Ta, which could be pathway or bridge. So Loli breaks this down to mean a calling of the universe toward the self, as a way of turning the body into a bridge between the universe and the real world. As a poet, I define Nahata as the actualization of a poem, or what Denise Levertov calls apperception, or being brought to speech after a constellation of experience draws language from the self. We are so moved so much that we are brought to language. Imagine when we first began communicating, what inspired those early humans to emote, to communicate, to share something. And we think of cave paintings as these early expressions, these early observations. that these particular people were so moved by what they saw, they had to replicate it. They had to mirror it. They had to create language. The model then shifts into the west, or the yellowed part of the model. And this is called Ina. And Ina literally translates to life, or this could also represent the action part of the model. So in Sahakes is connecting ourselves to a beyond, or to a universe. Nahata is using our body as a bridge, specifically through language, to actualize that thinking out into the world. Ina then is the way that we maneuver and negotiate and navigate the ways of these particular thought processes within the physical world. And finally, the model is completed in the north, or Sihasin, which represents assurance or reflection. Sihasin is really about the sustainability of the self, sustainability of family, community, nation, and world. Language frames our understanding of the world, and Sihasin is important in maintaining the effective and appropriate expression of language. So the model of Sa'ah is an integral part of the educational system at Tenet College. And my goal as an instructor has always been coding the system into my pedagogies in the classroom. It's also a way that I inform my writing process as a poet and writer. The first step, I think, as we begin to learn from this particular model, or begin to figure out the ways that we can reshape our current models, our current systems, our current structures, is first understanding that the self and the world are connected. Nsahakes, or the first step, asks us to evaluate our own connections to the world and beyond. We ask questions such as, what is our purpose? How do we practice respect? How do we practice responsibility? So if we were to turn this into a guide, a way of learning from particular indigenous heritages, maybe we can start there. What is our purpose? And how do we act respect? How do we be and act responsibility? And if we move into the second step, or in Sahakes, I would like to think it's about reimagining our language and lexicon and vocabulary. Because again, language is a part of our bodies, and our words shape reality. So in our pathway building and outlining and planning things that make up the Hat'a, we should examine the very language we plan to employ and scrutinize our words to ensure we speak and write with care and responsibility. In Diné, there's this belief that language is a spiritual thing. Language is a sacred being. Language is the structure of our reality. We have to be very careful with what we say, with what we do with language, because it can literally create worlds. And the third step of life and living, I believe, is the very acceptance that our current reality is not at all balanced, that this is not about achieving utopia, but it's the pursuit of balance. And it's the pursuit that creates the balance for us. And I think this step is also crucial in making sure that we are also tending to ourselves, that we can also carry our communities, of course, but we have to learn also how to carry ourselves in a very healthy and sustainable manner, especially in the middle of a pandemic, especially in the middle of shifting financial times, political realms. We ought to remember that we also have needs and desires in our own pursuits of this world. And of course, the fourth step, sihasin, or reflection and assurance, the looking back, the assessment, the ensuring that our processes are sustainable. An important part of sihasin is also bravery. The bravery to move things, change things, language things. It was bravery that forced me to make changes in my life and in my pedagogies and the way I talk about writing. And I'm pretty sure bravery moved you to change things in your life as well. While this may seem like an elementary concept, be brave, right? Bravery makes all the more sense now. After all, isn't it sort of brave to be here in this virtual room? Isn't it brave to just simply be? And I want to go ahead and end there. Thank you all so much for your time and attention and learning and exploring with me about the ways that we can begin to shape our languages and our realities and our systems by understanding the kinds of the kind of relationships that exist in our world and in our universe. And one core fundamental thing we can take away from Indigenous thoughts and lifeways is that we are part of a bigger universe. And our goal should be about sustainability, reciprocity, respect, and ensuring that everyone moves forward at the same pace in a kind of balanced way. Thank you all so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I
Can
think,
you guys,
Karen, are you ready for Q&A?
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. All right.
Yay! Sorry about the technology issues. So we are going to open up the floor for anyone to ask questions. Feel free to drop the questions in the chat and I can read them aloud for you guys as well.
I have one. I was wondering, how does being a part of the Dine, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, college community, how has that been a formative experience for you? And how do you think it has been a formative experience for your students as well?
That's a great question. And for me, I think it's just being around people that you feel a kind of familiarity with, right? You share a kind of shared perspective or shared living experience or lived experience. So you don't have to move through a room having to explain yourself a lot. You can just be and exist. And I feel like that's what happens at institutions across the country, right? They're just not sort of out in the open as they are here at Diné, because we're highly Diné centered, right? Or native centered. Whereas institutions are so large, right? But in my experience in working with a bunch of different colleges and universities, students have a way of finding these hubs or these centralized places where they can be themselves, right? And I especially love the way institutions like multicultural affairs offices and those types of diversity, equity, inclusion movements incorporate those gatherings, right? And really build policy and shape policy around those particular efforts.
Thank you. That was a wonderful answer.
I have a question about your own writings. So that first poem you shared with us, to me, it sounded like water dropping. So it was very interesting to find out what it's about. So I wanted to ask you about your own writings and if there has been, or maybe how language or Diné culture or Indigenous culture has influenced that, particularly sounds or structure.
That's a good question. So I began my writing career as a poet. I still identify myself as primarily a poet. And for me, poetry was actually one of the easier genres to grasp. And I think it's because of where I grew up. My mother was always telling stories. She would tell stories both in Diné and in English. And I feel like the way she told stories, the kind of movement that she moves through a narrative, right? It's never linear. It's kind of just jumping back and forth, focusing on movement and focusing on sound, right? The way she uses her breath, the way she pauses for laughter and things like that, and things of that nature, I believe really shaped the way I tend to manipulate my poetry as well. So growing up in that kind of rhythmic environment, I think really helped me really shape a kind of rhythmic force on the page using poetry.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Like I said, you can drop them in the chat too if you'd like. All right. Well, if not, I want to thank you so much for coming tonight. And an ever increasing world where people tell you paradigms or forced framework on you is absolutely refreshing to hear the perspective that I grew up with, especially about time and the way everything connects. So thank you for coming and sharing and opening up that world a little bit more to us. I hope to see that being incorporated in general society more as well. So thank you for also being flexible. I know with the flight and switching to virtual. Thank you to OMA and Kwame Heritage 365 for putting this event on during our Heritage Month. We really appreciate it and hope you guys all have a wonderful evening. And Oma, I think you guys have some closing remarks.
Yeah, great. Again, I would like to reiterate what Garen had to say. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you to everyone that came out, everyone that is watching over YouTube as well. It was a wonderful event. It was refreshing. It was a wonderful narrative, challenging, and it was a pleasure to hear. So I would just like to mention some of our upcoming OMA events that we have. For the rest of November, we are pretty chill, but in December we have the lighting of the quad. So come out and come to our booth. We're having free tote bags and t-shirts. And then OMA Cares during final season, where you can stop by the D&I Lounge to grab a snack. But that's all I've got. So thank you all for coming out. It was wonderful to have you all virtually. Thank you.